The need for creed.
Thou shalt not bow down before any graven image.
O worshippers of Christ the Messiah, there is something that we require. An answer to our questions from your learned ones is what we desire. If your God was in reality murdered by the actions of mere men, and if your God really did die, then what manner of God is he then? We wonder, was he pleased with what his killers subjected him to? If so, they were blessed by earning his pleasure, if only they knew. But if he was displeased by their act, then how can this be right? For in that case he was overwhelmed by their power and might. Was the entire universe left without a God or sustainer during that time? So who answered the prayers of those who sought help from the divine? Were the seven heavens left abandoned, with no God above to be found? While after his ordeal he was buried in a tomb, concealed near the ground? Were the worlds left alone to look after themselves, missing a God in loss, to manage their own affairs, whilst his own hands were nailed to the cross? How is it conceivable that he was left without his creation's help when he was nailed? Why didn't they rush to assist him when they heard his cries as he wept and wailed? How could the wood of the cross carry such a burden, knowing what it bore, if it had its own God fastened to it, unable to save the one it should adore? How could the iron of the nails pierce a God's body and have him pinned? How could it penetrate his flesh and mortally wound him, unable to rescind? How were the unworthy hands of sinful perpetrators even able to get near? With what power were his enemies able to strike him stealthily from his rear? And did Christ the Messiah resurrect himself from death back alive? Or was the reviver another God, as only the giver of life can revive? What a strange sight it must have been to see a God enclosed in a grave or tomb. Yet more peculiar is the concept of a God being constrained in the belly of a womb, where he was confined for 9 months. In darkness he was enveloped, nourished from the blood of the womb, until in gestation he developed. Then he spewed out from the birth canal, emerging as a baby, tiny and grasping, weak and helplessly reliant, anxious to be breastfed, mouth agape and gasping. If he ate and drank, then he would have naturally excreted in a diaper wad, as a consequence of answering the call of nature. Is this befitting for a God? The true God is exalted above the falsehoods attributed to him while Christians lie, and he will hold them to account for their libelous doctrine of him when they die. O worshippers of the cross, for what reason do you give it such veneration, and apportion blame upon those who reject it, assigning them to damnation? In rationality, considering its function, shouldn't the cross be broken and destroyed, along with he who innovated its significance? So St. Paul's dogma one should avoid. If the Lord was brutally nailed to the cross at the hands of his enemies in defeat, then the cross is cursed as a symbol of shame, and to glorify it is contempt and deceit. But instead of being despised, the object of affections is where the Lord died as he bled. Why glorify, carry, or kiss the wretched symbol when it should be trampled upon instead? How is it that the Lord of the worlds was humiliated upon it, yet you worship it in glee? If you adore the object that killed your God, then you have set yourself up as his enemy. Just because the cross carried the Lord of the worlds, is that the reason you extol? Seeing that the original one is lost, don't replicas remind you of its humiliating role? In that case, why don't you prostrate yourself and worship graves in a similar vein? Why is it acceptable to venerate the cross, yet you abhor tomb worship in disdain? Yet you don't venerate graves or tombs, even if one was used as your God's last haven. Since the tomb contained your Lord, why don't you worship it instead of seeing it as graven? So, O worshippers of Christ, wake up and realize the folly upon which you depend. For unlike God Almighty, Christ had a beginning, and in death he will have an end.